Thank you, said your name.
Michael.
I'm just waiting for them to be green.
And
I'm Martha King. We're contractors for Bernell Charter Schools. We get to prevent all matters. I'm from Cottonville in North Carolina. I've been with the Navajos for 15 years. And I'm over here about. I don't know.
his name was.
Martha King. My name is Alicia Adams, and I am a member of the Navajo Nation. I live in New Mexico, just outside of Gallup. And I'll give a little bit more of my background when we do that. When we get started, so we can introduce ourselves there.
His knowledge is.
I don't remember her last name. She's the new, she's Lisa.
Yeah, was the first year.
Yep. How can that be? No, that's not going to be the first two. Probably a lot of women in town, so it won't work.
Lisa first was that. No, woman.
Really? I don't know whether that. But now it's cheap.
Yeah, she his name was. He was in the region. See, I think you were attorney. Yeah, yes. I think we're down here in Alaska. Warmer.
Well, Alaska, they don't really respect federal rights.
Really?
But, oh, yeah, they fight the tribes really bad. So we look at now, it's like, federal law school, learn what it's supposed to be like, you work, not only exercise all your sovereignty. And then you can go back to Alaska and they know, you know, they get to tax, you know, they get to police, they get to SWAT, but really.
Mom, dad, whatever. Great grandpa. Yeah, I am. Like over here, they don't, what's the difference between like them respecting like?
We've had government to government relations for a long time. And then like I said, they kind of say it, but then they don't respect their own living. Their own regulation, people in an area, they fight it.
Yeah.
But some of the tribes, they don't care. So I represented, or I was doing it, and we doing federal court sessions all over New York. And I went out to one. And that tribal court, there were drug dealers. And the drug dealers were coming in and they were just making it worse and worse and worse in that community. And the tribal court was sick of it, and they didn't have policing power and down here respected. But the tribal court judges had seized someone and searched them. Found the stuff, finished them. And then, you know, everybody, whatever it is. They were not going to let me the whole city.
Yeah. Well, see, like here, my cousin, she was on the Reds. And her boyfriend and his friend moved in over there after my aunt passed. And they were cooking meth under the house. I found out, went over there, busted the house, we busted all the windows out and everything. My cousin can't go back to the bed at all. took off. And,
They finished?
vanishing for 1 year.
That was the one that doesn't finish. They have the power to, it's very
If you have, like, if you're making meth on the risk, they don't come back.
condition. Most times. I think the federal self vanish. Not vanish, vanishing forever.
Yeah. Mhm. If they catch her on their restriction, you know, she go back to prison, to federal prison for 7 years. Every time that she goes, she goes for 7 years, every time. I was stay away from that. No way.
That's actually hard. So you can't go to your relatives' graduation from high school. You can't go to the funeral. You can't go to the church. You can't go to the house that you're on. You can't go to ceremonies. You can't go get healed. You can't.
And they used to have a guy come in here, and he would do a ceremonies in the parks. And we do a constant park which was here, but we haven't been here since COVID. We're working on it. From started off that's what you. We need to do it, man. What we need is. What do you want?
Oh, yeah, I thought you started it. You can't come.
Okay.
You're good to go.
I didn't know that. We can get started then. All right. My computer. Good afternoon, everybody. Felicia Adams Initiative, Toronto Initiative, Natalie Wash's team, and Kai Dene, Nash Chair, Adams Initiative. Ayana Talk Initiative. My name is Felicia Adams. I am an educator, born for American, and I come from the community of the Upper Zone, which is located in New York City. I am a member of the network, which was I mentioned earlier. Before I go further, can you guys hear me okay on the Zoom?
Yes, I can, when you
Yes,
were,
okay.
yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yes.
Today I was invited by Board of Bernell and the Board of Bernell School, excuse me, and also Margaret King here, my colleague, it's a law firm here in Albuquerque. My background is in economic development and business. I went to school at Bernell College, which is a tribal college on the reservation. Then I went further to UNM here at the School of Law to take my business and tribal education and expand that to find out ways how we can protect opportunities and the interests of Native Americans and the surrounding communities. So that's my background. My reason for doing it is because I really feel like the law is the way to change things for our people, on an individual and on a community level. In addition to that, I was raised in the city for a portion of my life, and I didn't feel like I was actually giving back to my community. So when I say community, please understand that I don't just mean Native Americans, I mean people of all colors, because I represent different ethnicities. So please know I'm not counting anybody out, I'm counting everybody in, all right? And when I do use the term Indian today, I'm not trying to group everybody in a category. It's an actual legal term, so we're using it in a legal capacity. I do recognize the individual names and tribes. Is there anything you want to add before we go further? Anything I missed? No? All right.
Yeah, and get my certificate of code, the rest of the code. Okay.
That's right, thank you. I do have, so my focus in law school, the law goes in various directions. I chose to focus on Indian law and again on business. Business so we can provide for ourselves, basically. All right. So today we're learning Indian law basics. Because it's a newer topic here. More. Before we go further, just want to explain that the information that's presented today is just for informational purposes. It's not legal advice. We do not legal advice. It is best to contact the lawyer. We're not here in a representational capacity for any individuals or organizations. And then I'd also like to just ask if we could try to hold, I think we started a little late, so if we could try to hold the questions towards the end. I might answer some of those questions throughout the presentation, but you're still welcome to ask questions. All right, I'm going to sit down because it sounds like it's better for me to see from here. But the overview, we're here basically to focus on interactions with people, land, and government. And so we'll start with an introduction in general on Indian law. Then we'll go towards tribal powers and congressional relationship so basically the tribal relations with the federal government. We'll talk about what is Indian country and also what is tribal jurisdiction. Then we'll also talk about a few additional protections that are in place for tribes and tribal members and what steps that they can take to protect those interests. So you might be asking, why is it important? Whether you're a native or whether you're not a member of a tribe, you could still be affected by tribal laws. And so 4 main areas that we'll talk about today are jurisdiction. That entails who has the power to make legal decisions and judgments. Also what court system must be used. What laws are in place, what can be enforced, what's acceptable, if there's any penalties that apply for breaking any rules, and also what definitions apply. Where those laws also apply, what type of rights and powers and privileges exist. The courts, so where if there's an issue that's occurring, what court does it belong, so that people can resolve those issues. And also what authorities have the power to enforce the laws, how much power they have, and what can be done if they don't fulfill their responsibilities. Just a little bit of information. In terms of federally recognized tribes, there are over 500 in the United States. At least 23 of those are in New Mexico. There are 19 Pueblos, 3 Apache tribes, and also the Navajo Nation.
Number 204, you're in. For me to do, you're not going to rights.
We'll get to that in the presentation. If you can hold that, we'll answer some of those questions for you, actually. So tribal sovereignty itself, does anybody know what tribal sovereignty is or what sovereignty? Anybody familiar with that? Want to take a stab at it? Yeah. Answer right here. You can read it to me.
The right to govern yourself and find the law. That's what we're saying about it. And President Northwest Alliance for 30 years.
The time immemorial, right? I mean, before time was even being tracked. Since the beginning of time, basically sovereignty means they have the power over themselves. Them being an individual, them being a group of people, the tribes in general have this power. That also means that another person does not have power over them. So, you know, as an adult, right, there's very few people who have power over the decision or action of another adult, for example. Some of those examples, supreme power, right? That's another way to look at it. Means free from external control, the right to self-govern, land, economy, governance, and culture. So they have the right over those things. They can choose their own culture, their own way to make money, their own land, or what to do with the land that they occupy. Some areas that conflict with tribal sovereignty today stem from policy, the Constitution, case law, federal laws, and state laws. Today, we're going to talk about some of the policies, some parts of the Constitution, and some cases, some major cases that affect tribal sovereignty. And another way to look at sovereignty of a government, like how the United States was established, is that power comes from the people. Some of the tribal powers that exist today involve the ability to govern the members of their tribe, some non-members of the tribe in certain cases, and also their own affairs. Specifically with members, that can include who is and who is not a member to the tribe. What happens in criminal matters or civil matters, and also domestic relations such as marriage, adoptions, and custody over children. For non-members, that can also include power when there's violence, domestic violence, right, against women or others, specifically women, because that's been a really highlighted issue over the past few years, and also certain business transactions and civil matters. So this list is not a total list of all the tribal powers, and as you saw in the previous slide, with so many tribes that are in existence today, that actually those powers vary amongst tribes. So not all the tribes share the same powers.
Or exercise their own power. So there's my friend, we really only use individual welfare, and then we do administrative programs. But we're not really out there policing, jailing, or we're definitely not doing violence against women, prevention. We're not doing like fencing in divorce, or anything like that. Our tribe is really providing housing, roads, and airports, and handling conventional welfare.
So basically, what's with the United States consent to your people and how they and build up your.
I think it's more, what's the issues in that village and what is the council comfortable to address? They could go all in like now and do policing and jailing, but maybe they didn't feel historically that was something wanted to do, so they just don't exercise that. So we have written laws, things like that, we're not doing dog control or anything.
So some of that has to do with the resources, right? They don't have enough resources to do it themselves, and sometimes they just don't, because they need the assistance to Or they just got,
Vegetation and schools and stuff we get, sorry.
All that. It's almost like maybe the villagers don't say, hey, this is what we want the council to address. And the council's like, we have enough programs and, you know, we have the gravel pit we gotta do, and we have these other federal programs where we're just doing any more people.
so it varies by child, so every, definitely,
It's like now, when they started doing that, and the government started to go into mine resources from them. And then they said, wait, hold on, you guys can't do that, this is ours. Then the government went and made a check for them, like, come on, and you guys just doing this just to get over on us. So you can get stuff from our land just to benefit you,
if we have more time today, we could talk about all of that, but yes, you are right. There are definitely different interests that are being balanced when it comes to making those decisions. But more tribal powers, and they can govern their lands, commercial activity, environmental protection, and safety, well-being of the people. They can enact taxes and, of course, enact laws to make sure those actions are followed through on. So there's the supreme tribal sovereignty, right, that started off as time immemorial, and through a variety of, like I said, laws that are in place, and also cases that have happened that have turned into law, that supreme power has diminished, it's gone down. And so that process is called, abrogation of sovereignty, which means to take away, to invalidate, or to void as a legal action. So many ways that supreme power has gone down some for tribes. And these are some major cases that have contributed to that abrogation. And we'll talk more about some of these major ones, but this is just to kind of give you a timeline from, as early as the 1700s, when the discovery doctrine was put in place that attempted to regulate trade and land transactions. Basically saying, who can do business with tribes, who can buy tribal land. And then came the Constitution in the 1700s, late 1700s, that said only Congress can do commerce, which is do business with Indians. And then 1800s, there were some major cases that began that started to say, well, the United States owns the land now. The tribes no longer own title to their land.
So we're in a certain amount of time with them with ground, we're in a certain amount of time where they get the ground.
That's a very loaded question. I think that answer is beyond the scope of today. Just because, like I said, each tribe is different, and each treaty and agreement and reservation that's put in place can vary. So my answer to that, it varies. It depends on what the tribe is and what the agreements are. But we have other tribes who bought their land back. Who've won in court. There's New York, there's Oklahoma, and then Steady, who, different ways. So I think we can talk, maybe answer some of those questions later. Don't give up is the point. There's always a way. There's always a way, and law is one of those ways to answer that question. Several reservation policies were then put in place in the 1800s. That's where the United States entered into treaties with tribes. Told them we're not going to battle it out anymore as long as you stay on your reservation, and we'll take care of you guys, and here's how we'll take care of you. Then there were some 1800s again. There was some conflict between the states who said, well, we want to also exercise power over tribes, and the United States said that's not going to happen. Only the federal government can do that. And The reason why the federal government says that is because they have what's called a guardianship and dependent relationship. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but that's, in family law, you would see that as a child, right? And the parent, the guardian, or somebody who's legally responsible for the child. So in some of these cases, they said that tribes cannot take care of themselves as a child. And so the United States government has to take it. That is how they justified some of the power that was taken away from tribes. By all means, let me make my disclaimer, I don't advocate for any of those ideas. It's just the way history and the law have come into play so far. So then there was more cases in the 1900s that started to say not only, it basically was saying that the land is owned by the United States government and the United States is giving permission to tribes to be here. That's why there's a permission. That was a tour through, gosh, for 100 years. And so again, like I said, we would talk about some of the major ones. These three cases are called the Marshall Trilogy. They were opinions written by Chief Justice John Marshall back in the 1800s, and they founded a lot of what federal Indian law is founded upon. So Johnson v. McIntosh was a case in which one man bought his land directly from Indian tribes, and a second man bought the same land from the United States. So these two gentlemen went to court over the land, and the second man who bought his land from the United States government, who's McIntosh, won because they said that tribes couldn't sell the land. They didn't own it, they didn't have the title, only that right was vested in the United States government. So you see how, oh, was there a question? No, oh, okay. So those were two non-native gentlemen, and you can see how this was a dispute that actually didn't actually involve Indians, but it still affected. It was a law that was really used to establish who has ownership over the land. Another loaded question, which is actually going to be discussed here. It really depends on what's why, part of the reason why this presentation is being brought today. Where you have these laws need to follow, what laws apply to you, and also where you can go to resolve some legal issues.
One of the when I was very young, my dad passed away, and we were in Mexico, and he had a drain out there. I don't know how many times it was, they never told me about it. The wheel, there was like 9 other very sisters. We got my parents information. But seriously, they were using other way or anything like that. They put that out of comfort, they want to go at the end of the
We can certainly try that would be around like a family law. But it's a big question, and so then to give you that a little bit, right? Depending on which type of land it is, then those laws would tell you who would have the rights to that. Well, you think the business on them, so you don't get that.
So at some point, and then you go over there and you they'll figure all the who owns it, where it's at.
I can take a look at that later. If you don't want me to. So that's just one case. The second case, Cherokee Nation, the Georgia was a jurisdiction dispute. There, basically the state of Georgia was saying, well, the Cherokee tribe is in our state of Georgia, so they have to follow our law. And the Cherokee tribe went to the federal court and said, we don't want those laws to apply. That was the dispute, basically. And unfortunately, that case was not in the tribe's favor, but that's only because they took the wrong legal. They tried to say, well, we're like a state, so we have the right to be here. And the court said, you're not like a state, you're a territory. This is not the right place. Plus, the federal government is the one, is the body you need to go to resolve this. And so they did. They used another case, which actually involved some more non-natives, which is Worcester v. Georgia, where there were a group of non-natives who wanted to live on the Cherokee Nation. And back then in the 1800s, if you were a non-native who wanted to live on a tribe, you had to get a permit from Georgia, and they had to give you permission. And then you had to say, I swear, my loyalty to the United States. They didn't want, that they didn't want Americans switching sides and supporting tribes when there was a lot of conflict. So then that case was somewhat in the tribe's favor. It at least said clearly that states do not have authority over tribes, at least in tribal territory. So those are some major cases. If you ever were to look these cases up, they're probably hundreds of pages, and so we condensed it down to a couple of paragraphs just to give you some background on these, again, the foundations of federal Indian law. All right. Another major factor in federal Indian law is the Constitution itself. So if you look at this, you'll see there's the whole United States government. And there you'll see on the right, the states have their own powers. They're their own sovereigns. And then there's the federal government, who's also its own sovereign. The states, again, is in red because they do not have the power over Indian tribes. However, on the federal side, you'll have the legislative side, which is like the congressmen, right, your lawmakers. They have their power through the Commerce Clause, which says that only Congress has the power to regulate commerce with Indian tribes. Then they also are responsible for making laws that affect Indian tribes, and they also have the power to make treaties with Indian tribes. On the judicial side, that's if a case is brought to federal court from an Indian tribe, that's where the judicial branch has power. And then the executive branch, which is like the president and all of these departments under the president, they have power through agencies, and that power comes from the legislative branch. And those are some ways that they can exercise power with Indian tribes, also with an executive order. So I don't know if that helps visually see where the power goes and the interaction with Indian tribes. And actually, let's go back there real quick. It's one sentence is what has really sparked so much of this power. As you can see, it's very broad, right? It's not really detailed. It's not a list to say you can only do this with tribes and you can only do with that. It's just this broad authority through that one sentence. But that's been translated, into other powers and duties such as these. Power to regulate commerce, right? Commerce is, business transactions. modify the sovereignty of dependent entities. So if this goes to what I mentioned earlier about when a tribe is considered dependent, then Congress has the ability to, broaden or narrow the scope of their power, the tribe's power. They also can sell tribal land, and they can also define what is a reservation boundary, and they can make that smaller or bigger if they want to as well. So as the guardian of these dependent entities, Congress has the duty of care, loyalty, and candor, which is somewhat of a fiduciary. A fiduciary responsibility usually means they have something that's of value that they're taking care of for the benefit of somebody else. So here, the federal government is responsible for the management and conservation of assets, property, and resources. That's the value. They put some of those resources, specifically land, into trust for the benefit of tribes. So they can't just let tribes, do bad. They have the responsibility, right, to take care of them in a way. And so that's, in a nutshell, what some of the powers and duties are. So going back to, we're going here really quick. So back to this, on this legislative side, they're the ones who write the laws and say, we're going to give you some power, right? They can give it to tribes, or they can actually give it to other governmental agencies, such as the Department of Interior, Education, Land Management, Indian Affairs, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Justice, and Indian Health Services. So Congress says to the executive branch, it tells the president, I want you guys to be in charge of this. The president tells the secretary, his or her secretary of Interior, this is how I want you to be responsible for it. I want you guys to be responsible for these things. And so those are some examples of agencies that are being delegated with power that comes from Congress. So now we come to Indian country. What is Indian country? This goes to the question that was asked earlier, right? Where does some of that power lie, and what types? And the answer was, depends on the type of land where it's the activities are occurring. So Indian country is defined as land within the limits of Indian reservation under the jurisdiction of the U.S. So if there's a tribe in Mexico, the United States doesn't have jurisdiction over them, right? So they don't fit under this definition of Indian country. Another group or set of Indian country is dependent Indian communities within the borders of U.S. So some of those often are considered like border towns, right? Those are like the Perus and the Gallups, or I can't say that Albuquerque is with the community, but it might. It depends on who's at the table discussing it, but basically they're communities that are within reservation bounds. And then there are Indian allotments, which we'll talk a little bit more. You guys may have heard of that, but that's actually where title has been given to Indians individually. And then there are informal reservations that exist. And so any of those four can be considered Indian country. That means that it wasn't established through like a treaty or some legal document, such as or like an executive order. So the Navajo Nation started off as like a small little spot when they wrote the original treaty, and that treaty was through the Congress. But then the president, who doesn't have this power anymore, but presidents were able to expand the tribal boundaries through executive orders. So there are formal ways to establish a reservation. And then here it's saying that there's informal. So that could be maybe tribes have bought their land back, right? And it hasn't gone through the process yet of becoming a legal reservation, but there's still Indians that occupy that land. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so one thing to note here at the bottom, there's a case that says that land retains its reservation. I don't know what that means.
Just touch the screen.
Touch the screen, huh?
Touch.
Cool. Land retains its reservation status until Congress explicitly indicates otherwise. So if it's considered a reservation, unless Congress says it's not a reservation, it's still a reservation. That's pretty much what it's saying. So somebody can't buy the title and then say, well, because I'm a non-native and I own this, it's not reservation anymore. It's not. Congress will still have the last word. And that word needs to be clear and in writing.
Yeah, that's true. Then I sold back my land. And they told me I could only sell my land back to the tribe. Couldn't sell to anybody else, so I sold back to the tribe. Yeah, you should still sell it.
Okay, so here are some examples of types of land that fit under Indian country. So fee simple land is a term that's used to say that it's not a reservation specifically, right? If anybody can own the land. So with reservation, it's reserved for Indians. With fee simple land, anybody can own it pretty much. And they are subject to taxation, property taxes and whatnot. But if you own fee simple land, so fee simple land might be, property, a house in Albuquerque, for example. You can buy it, you can sell it, you can lease it out, that's your land. Trust land that's reserved for Indians is land that's set aside by the federal government specifically for Indians. And that land is not subject to federal taxation.
You can't get taxed on it. You trust on it.
Not by the state
By the federal government, you can.
and individual. So any questions, guys? They're making me like, wait a minute, check my notes.
I think I owe somebody some money.
Okay, so the title of the land, right? That can't be owned by just anybody. The federal government is the one who holds the title to reservation land. Now, allotments are this, we'll call this like a special project that happened in the 1900s. So they took reservation land and they, put it in squares and they started giving it to Indians. And they said for 25 years, you can have this land. It's kind of like a hybrid, like you have your 25 years and you don't have taxes on it and you own the title, but after 25 years, it turns into fee simple land. So that's why we have checkerboard places throughout reservations. Some of those lands were given title to individuals who then sold those lands to non-natives. So then you'll have, some parts of the reservation where you can be on the reservation and take a few steps and you're off the reservation. And so whoever owns the title to these allotments, it's still considered Indian country. And then there are dependent Indian communities, as you recall on that list. That is a non-reservation land. And they're outside of the Indian reservation. It could be private property, it could be fee simple land, but it's still considered Indian country.
So like our reservation is water, my village, water is like, it's sitting next to things that we have.
wanted that separated in camps. Camps for like they say, and when that goes to the so we are using part of the administration.
That's what you're arguing, so if a lawyer wants to, want to know that. Because it could be this category, which could be a Indian country, which could be a jurisdictional issue, and I'll tell you what court would have to be in. By the way, this is the, federal Indian law is categorized as the most complicated area of law for this reason, because for one, there's all these rules that shot out of all these Supreme Court cases. Some of these Supreme Court cases aren't even full majority votes and stuff. There, some people voted this way, some people voted this way. So you have to be among things. So reading make, Congress didn't make this mess. It's sort of the Supreme Court, and Congress made some of these messes. And the Supreme Court overlaid decisions. You have to know the answers to a whole bunch of things to do an analysis. So, but that's good that you're identifying like, hey, we used to be there, like Colonel said, this and up that area where the attorney want to know that it could.
It is good that you recognize it, and that ties to your question earlier about getting the land. So it depends on what type of land it is, because then once you identify them, you have to identify history and the path to getting the land back, or if it's even a possibility. But there are several tribes who are beginning to buy their land back where the reservation is, turning it into reservation, or just keeping it as fee simple. So you kind of go if you, depending on how you use the law, it could be your friend or it could be your enemy. But if you really love the law, you can use this information as a resource to, really advocate for those endeavors. So here's another pretty popular federal Indian law case, United States versus Kagama. Kagama was a member of a tribe. Him and another tribal member were indicted for basically killing another Indian, and they were on the reservation when it happened. So this would be considered an Indian, and they were charged. Although it was on reservation land, they were charged with under federal law, federal court. And so Kagama was saying he took this case to court because he said, well, you guys don't have jurisdiction over an Indian in this land, in Indian country. It didn't go in his favor, and some of the key takeaways from that case. It basically reinforces that Congress has the power to govern dependent nations, basically. The legislature can control jurisdiction of crimes committed within reservations because the tribal governments owe all the powers to the statutes of the United States that give plenary power to Congress, which is total power. So basically, yes, it happened on the reservation, but Congress has power over the reservation. So therefore, we do have jurisdiction and we can charge you with this crime under the Major Crimes Act, the law that we created.
All law time for the third constitution laws. And if you go back to the day, like when we first broke the law, is that law that was not?
I don't understand. Can you
say what if they have needed the Major Crimes Act and took away that?
Congress can't do that. They can say, just kidding. We give you your power back if they want to. But if they did that, they would have to make it another law. They can't just go on TV and say, oh, we give all tribes all the power. Right? They have to go through that whole legislative process to do so. And another interesting case is United States v. Wheeler. So Mr. Wheeler was a Navajo who was charged with disorderly conduct and contributing to the delinquency of a minor on Navajo land. So he pled guilty in the Navajo court and went to jail for it and also had to pay a fine. Then a year later, the federal court came in and charged him with statutory rape. Same thing happened. There, he was also convicted for, and then he was ordered to do time there. Wheeler took this case to court to say, you can't do that, that's double jeopardy, right? He said, you're charging me 2 times for the same crime. That's not right. But the case did not end in his favor. And so something to take away from this case is that when a tribe criminally punishes a member, it does so on its own as an independent sovereign, which is separate from the federal government. So they're 2 different governments. So technically, it's not the same crime. Does that make sense?
We can get charged twice.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is a good example, but I think it's happening with Trump. Right? He has a case in New York, he has a case in Florida, and they're for similar issues. And that's because it's 2 different governments. Yes, it was the same activity, but it happened in 2 places. I guess in his example, that's one example of why you see some people doing, courts in different states. The different sovereign governments that are. So see why it's very important to know, reading the laws and, whose land you're standing on and whose laws you got to follow. Okay, that's the major takeaway from that case. So Indian criminal jurisdiction can get kind of, what they say, clear as mud. And this is just a little table to kind of break that down. So if there's an Indian offender on the left, right, and there's a non-Indian offender on the right. So just going down the left side, if there's an Indian who commits a crime against another Indian within Indian country, then you go here to see that under the major, if it's a major crime, then it would go under federal jurisdiction. If it's anything that's outside of that Major Crimes Act, then they may also be held and brought into court under a tribal court as well. Now, if it's an Indian against a non-Indian, it might still be a federal court issue if it's a major crime or another federal crime that's identified. Or if it's not in one of those, then it might still go under tribal court. So
You can have non-native you tried in tribal court as well.
we're going to talk about that right now. So that would be the non-Indian offender, right, on the right side. So if they commit a crime against an Indian within Indian country, they're going to federal court. Now, if it's a non-Indian against a non-Indian, then most likely they're going to go to state. Does that make sense? Is that a little easy to digest? All right. So these are very complex. Figure we went to school for several years to see this.
Let's say that it was a non-native, really found against the native. Who do you contact for that kind of jurisdiction?
So that's, if it depends. Did it happen on the reservation on an Indian country?
No.
If it's outside of Indian country, then it depends on where it was. So if it's like in the city of Albuquerque, then most likely the state government is going to come to play for that.
So
Can you say that again?
same thing, either public place or a railway phone or a street.
Because that's not in Indian country. So this table here applies to if something is happening within Indian country.
Yeah,
Also, like if someone like, we get some Indian, just like they were one person, and I'll go to federal, just like, which time.
It could, if it's not a major crime. So if it's a major crime, then it would go to federal and possibly tribal, because we just saw that it's not double jeopardy. If it's both federal and tribal, then guys gotta leave these Indians alone. No, but, no, so, yeah, it's, that's why it's important to know, are you within Indian country, we'll go over this again, just a couple of slides. But this is just kind of a breakdown of how much it matters and what laws are in place. So then that goes to what we talked about also in the beginning. If there is a tribal court, the tribe might not actually have it. There might not be any tribal court that this can be resolved at, so that's another.
That'd be a pretty small tribe, huh?
They tried 450 people.
Mm.
They don't actually come up with if somebody, if it's out of control, they probably take it for themselves.
San Diego was very good, about right over 500. I have a friend of mine that was in jail, and he was on the council over there too.
So then there's what's called exhaustion. That doesn't mean we're tired. Probably you guys are being tired with some of this content today, but no, it's actually, this is, oh, I didn't put the case name here. So basically there was a case that occurred, and I believe there was a non-native who hit a child in the school parking lot. And he tried to say, well, you guys don't have jurisdiction over me. So he said, we need to handle this in federal court. And it actually didn't end in his favor. It was in the child's favor, because basically the Supreme Court said, you can't just pick your court. You need to go to the tribal court and at least try to resolve the matter before you bring it to federal. And so that's called exhaustion. You have to exhaust your tribal court remedies before you can go into a federal. Or even before the federal court will even look at it. So that's, it's kind of like respect, right? It's like saying, don't try to undermine the tribal court. Go there, try to resolve it in their way, and if you can't, then there's another way.
It was on the reservation.
Correct. Yeah, you can't, be in Chicago and then this happens and you bring it into. There are some things that happen off the reservation that can be brought into the tribal court, but this is not one. Ideally. So just to kind of bring that, back and to look at some of the factors when it comes to determining what, criminal jurisdiction for the tribe. You want to ask, did the offense happen in Indian country?
Do you remember the beginning of it?
Give me at least one. Dependent Indian communities.
Like the Gallup. Maybe it's not, but it's certainly not lawful.
What is the hundred?
And then you want to ask, what kind of offense? Is this going to go under like the major crimes, or is this something that we can take care of this year? We don't need to take it to court. You want to ask if the victim was Indian, Was the offender Indian? And did they go to the tribal court first? Did they at least try to resolve it to a tribal? Those are some factors. So criminal, meaning there was, somebody broke the law, right? That's an offense against the government in a way. Civil is an offense against a person. So a civil case would be brought for example, disputes against two natives, or maybe there was a broken contract, maybe there's some hunting and fishing rights, or maybe there's some child custody matters, for example. Those are some examples of civil matters that would be brought into a tribal court. I think it's going to be shared on, made available to everybody. Yeah,
Yeah, well, you guys need to see it. We'll see if, we get a copy of the.
yeah, either email it, or if you have a USB, you can take care of that today too. Oh, yeah. Oh, I will.
Thank you.
Okay, you good? Indian Civil Rights Act, also known as ICRA, is a law that was put in place that basically prevents tribes from violating basic civil rights. So there's, if you guys are familiar with the civil rights movement, that happened in the 1800s, or excuse me, not 1800s, 1960s. Sorry, I was somewhere else. So in the 60s, everybody was all, pro civil rights. Well, the Indians also got their civil rights as well. But there's like basically a baseline that tribes can't cross to say, you can't take these civil rights from people just because you're Indian or just because you're on the reservation. That is, so everything in the civil rights are protected, except tribes don't have to have appointed counsel in certain cases, grand jury or civil trial. Those are not always given to individuals. This civil rights, the ICRA also gives, the agency or bureau authority and responsibility to decline recognition of tribal action that violates ICRA. So if the tribe creates a law, the BIA can say it's not going to, you know what I mean? So that's what this law says. If they violate ICRA, if a tribe violates ICRA, then somebody can actually go to federal court and they can file what's called a habeas corpus application. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, to say this court is not doing what it's supposed to. I'd like to bring my matter to someone else to resolve it. This ICRA also encourages exhaustion of tribal forms. So we talked about that earlier. It tries to say, let's resolve it within the tribal courts. But it does not.
This was, where they're asking the court to show the reason of proof by a person not being federal.
Habeas corpus means bringing the bottom. It's when you have. Like, we do, that's the really.
You mean this right here, the next slide?
It said, yeah, habeas corpus means being in front of the law. It's like,
You mean
if
what's
the
the,
person's not there, then we need to show proof or burden of proof by bringing somebody to prove for themselves.
no, but we'll go over it in a few more slides if you don't mind waiting, so we can just go through this one. So ICRA itself basically says no Indian tribe exercising self-government can put into law put a law into place that denies the right to religion or speech, or freedom from, they shouldn't deny any of those top 10 there. So unreasonable search and seizures, no double jeopardy. You should still have the protection not to testify against yourself. If there's any property taken for public use, there should be just compensation. There's still a right to a speedy and public trial. There's still freedom from excessive bail, basically cruel and unusual punishment. Still due process and equal protection from the laws. And still trial by jury. So how ICRA differs specifically from the Constitution's Bill of Rights. The tribe does not have to, the tribe can establish a religion if they want to. So, you know, in the United States, they have separation of religion, church and state. Yeah, thank you. Guys are sharp. And then also lawyers can be at criminal defendant's own expense. So a tribe does not have to provide a lawyer for somebody who cannot afford one. And then last on there,
Okay, wait a second. Some, the tribe has to provide a lawyer to indigent defendants in some cases.
in some cases.
Does that mean you want money to hire a lawyer?
If we have a meeting.
You just have to think you have counsel. You know.
For a later term.
And then the tribe does not have to provide a jury trial in civil case. Those are some items in ICRA. Another major,
The thing on that one, did you understand the context? As a criminal defendant. Some of the rights that you have a right to speak in public trial by jury, equal protection of the law, you understand.
How can we get around this? Would they have us on these things? We're going over the Constitution by not allowing us to bail. Then we come in, they automatically take us with bond. It's a no bond rule.
are you talking about tribal court?
No, this here in the district court.
We're talking specifically about tribes right now.
Yeah, is there any related to the public workers office?
What she's talking about is when you get nailed in front of the tribal court, we still have US constitutional protections. As you set forth up there.
On the reservation, right? Like anything that happened on the reservation.
When you're nailed in front of the tribal court.
Federal or tribal. When I'm in charge for, right?
Right, or state.
Okay.
And then his question is about state, which is not representation.
Yeah, so the
So
state.
maybe we'll have time to try to figure that out later. Or maybe we'll run out of time. It isn't some kind of card, but looking about it.
Yeah, and you're sure.
But the state choose the group what happened with news, the state has nothing to do with it.
Well, she was saying, the difference on it, right, remember the Indians and non-Indians.
Yeah.
All that tells you whether the state is gonna be handling that problem.
Because when I went to court, I had asked for a counsel. One year I asked for a trial, and my lawyer. My lawyer divided the probation, and they divided the probation, they divided the trial and probation.
So we'll get through that.
Well, she just gave up on it.
Indian law and the federal Indian law. We'll get through that, and then we'll you have someone, we'll go into the EPG and brainstorm on health education. You know, but this presentation is about dealing with the trouble.
So let me start breezing through a little bit more since I didn't realize the time here. Okay, so another major law it's called the Indian Child Welfare Act. And this is specific to handling child abuse and neglect and adoption cases involving Native children. So it governs state child custody proceedings. In some ways by recognizing tribal jurisdiction over decisions for their Indian children, establishing minimum federal standards for the removal of Indian children from their families, establishing preferences for placement of Indian children with extended family or other tribal families, and instituting protections to ensure that birth parents' voluntary relinquishment of their children are truly voluntary. It also recognizes the best interests of the child, maintains tribal connection, and recognizes children's value to the Indian tribal families. So ICWA is only going to apply if the child or parent is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe. Or,
Okay.
yet,
You probably, okay, they had terminating rights, and then this was taken in, that the children need to be, children.
and then other protections, so in the First Amendment, right, the First Amendment still applies to tribes to say that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. There's also the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, protecting and preserving the right to freedom and right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of American Indians. There's also a case called Employment Division of Oregon v. Smith. So that one was basically a gentleman who was trying to use POE outside of the reservation, and the state said he can't. And that case said that if it's against the law in the state, then it's going to be considered criminal. It's a criminal religious. But that's specific things. It's not just your practice, right? It's just that POE itself is considered in some states, correct? But here in New Mexico, for example, use of peyote is considered a bona fide religious ceremony. And if it's done within a ceremony by, a bona fide religious organization, then they're exempt from the law, at least from the federal and requirements of law specific to drug abuse and prevention control. So again, knowing where you're at, right, and what you believe, that matters too, but there are protections in place to exercise your freedom of religion and as a Native American. There's also what's called NAGPRA, which is Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This specifically is to protect Native American human remains, cultural patrimony. So those are, items passed on from generation to generation. Funerary items, those can be, revolving around death or funerals, and then objects of cultural patrimony. So there are a variety of rules on how this can be applied, but basically it's to protect Indian bodies and remains, because back in the day, people used to go and like grave rob and take, cultural items. There are some things, so this is not just looking at current and forward, but there's some protection for them as well. And so a remedy, what's here to fix something. So if somebody has breached their duty, the government has breached their duty, there are certain remedies. There's claims for money damages. There's also injunctive relief. It's also known as an injunction. It can restrain a party from doing certain acts, or it can also require them to do certain acts. It's usually only available when there's no other remedy that's available to fix the harm that's been done. Habeas corpus, which was asked earlier. There's certain exceptions, but in general, every person in prison or otherwise restrained of his liberty may pursue a writ of habeas corpus to obtain relief from such imprisonment or restraint if it proves it to be unlawful. So I'm not supposed to be here. It's against the law to have me imprisoned here or have me arrested. That's why somebody would file for habeas corpus. And then you can always write laws to fix things. You don't have to fight all the time. You can just say, hey guys, let's get along, let's put it into law, and here's how we're gonna go. We're almost done, guys. So just to recap, right, to bring it back forward, and to emphasize, why are we here? It's to understand the jurisdiction, the laws, and the courts and authority. And then also just FYI, just to protect, those that have been over incarcerated, right? They're underrepresented, but they're also overrepresented in terms of incarceration. So we'd like to, also contribute to, if you know the law, then you know how not to break the law, right? You know how to stay within the law and you know how to stay out of incarceration, or you can at least pass that information around. And lastly, there are some legal resources. Again, this PowerPoint presentation will be made available to you all. But if you want to look for tribal law, there are, so each tribal court is going to have their own way of doing these. At least in New Mexico, there's a link here where you can go out and find out how each tribal court in New Mexico handles their courts in the state, or at least for Indian country. Then there's information for state law, and there's also information for federal Indian law, which can be found at these resources as well. And then just so you know, there's some of these we talked about, but these are some more major legislative acts that affect Indians and Indian country. And that is it. So thank you all. I don't know if we want to go ahead and pause. If we have time for questions, I don't know. I know we have a lot of questions throughout. If we can tap on this. Okay. Good. So are there any questions? So, I'm a sister, I'm a mother, so this comes from that relation. Who is they? We say they. It's personal stuff. We're gonna stop the recording. So, okay, we're gonna stop. Some public, the other way, private. And you can't have it, like, so, fire the same with it. Stop the, you would have direct the control over that,
There was a thing where, she like my ex-wife, she's from Mexico. And I know that there's some restrictions, you can't take my children to Mexico.